Thank you all. Rick, thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Okay, that's good. Let's see. I'm going to be talking about context and how to build a controlled vocabulary, embedding context in every element. And as I was thinking about this, it occurred to me that I'm basically telling the same story I've been telling for a while, but making some significant changes for this conference. And I thought, well, it could be a little risky because this the story of the vicar who can't think of a sermon topic, and it's Saturday night, he's pacing the floor, can't think of what he's going to talk about. He turns to his wife and says, I know, I'll give a sermon about water skiing. She goes, well, don't expect to see me in the front pew tomorrow watching you make a fool of yourself. I'm staying home. So he has a sleepless night, trudges off to the church, and he's hit with what can only be called divine inspiration. He says, I know I won't give a sermon about water skiing. I'll give a sermon about the joy of sex and the wonder of physical and spiritual union. A little risky, but he carried it off. It was brilliant, and the parishioners were enthralled. And one of them saw the vicar's wife the next day in the shops and said, it's too bad you weren't there yesterday because your husband gave the most amazing sermon. The vicar's wife said, well, that's really puzzling because he's only tried it twice and he fell off both times. So it's always a little risky to change things at the last minute, but I'm hoping that by taking my presentation and focusing on context, I won't fall off. Anyway, so I'll go through some of this fairly quickly. I've been doing this quite a while. I don't want to stress this too much, but I was actually involved in information architecture before the internet was born. So that's why some of these years are in double digits. But what I really love is being able to design a controlled vocabulary that really meets users' requirements and makes information easier to find. And then particularly if you can link that with an automated classification system that gives you better accuracy in the tagging of the content and better search results, that's really sort of the sweet spot. So I've been very fortunate over the last 20 some years to work for some really fun clients, both in government and corporate, and some influential charities. That's just a small sample. Now, does anybody watch Only Connect? Yes, okay. Or do the New York Times puzzle that they ripped off from Only Connect, the grid of the, yeah, okay. So here's an example. This is a real life example. So if you've already done this puzzle and know the answer, but what I wanted to point out here is that if all you see are these 16 words and you don't have the context of what connects them, it's basically just ambiguous symbols. They only have meaning really in context or in connection with other words. So you see seal there in the second row. So is that an aquatic mammal? Is it something that's protective? Is it a UK musician? There are lots of different possibilities here. Is nose, head, and ear connected? Is bulb and candle connected? Is light sources? There's our friend seal. Maybe it's engine and hose. Those things are related. But until you can actually come up with a connecting theme or string, they're just ambiguous symbols. So you need the context. So I'm sure you all had solved this before I got here. But turns out that hose is a slang term for a ripoff, along with to stiff somebody or fleece them. Our nose was actually part of an airplane. Units of vegetables, that's where bulb came in. And seal was one of the things made of wax. So now you've got some context. So you're taking words that maybe have similar associations, but until you actually find a unique way to group them, they don't really make sense. So what I wanted to do is look at how you can build a controlled vocabulary from the beginning to the end and try to ensure that you've got context at every stage. So I came up with something called the cycle of context. And if we start at the very top, that's basically where you engage with specialists. So if you want something that's user-centric, it's a good idea to start with users. And a lot of you come from a user or usability background, but I'm sure that you understand the need at the very early stage to talk to your users about the terms they use. So it's not so much a design pathway, it's more an understanding of their world and the terms that they use, vocabularies, to define their world. And once you engage with specialists, you can then find out key documents or repositories of documents that they use in their work or their everyday lives. And you can then look at maybe some existing vocabulary. So you're not starting from scratch. So you talk to the specialists, say, where are the documents that you use? Where are the vocabularies that may already be in use? They may be helpful, they may not, but let's start with those. And you engage with the specialist before you even started building any structure at all. Then your next step is really to build your initial taxonomy. So you want a hierarchy. So you're looking for a common thread like we were with the puzzle, but one that is fairly consistent and unique, because obviously we know from the puzzle example that things can be gathered together in lots of different groups. So maybe you're looking for the easiest or the most logical way to group things together that represents a hierarchy. Now, if that's all you had to do, your job would be easy. But very often when you're building the hierarchy, you say, wait a minute, some of these specialists are using this term A, but other people are using term B, and it's the same thing. What do I do? Or you say, well, there's actually a whole another area that's related to this, but how do I show that in the taxonomy? Luckily, you're not limited just to taxonomy. You've got other structural tools, which we'll describe in a minute. But one thing about the building stage of the taxonomy is there are a lot of tools that you can use. I see that actually we're being sponsored by one of the providers of one of these tools. So you can do card sorting, you can do mind mapping, you can do tree testing. So there are a number of things that you can do at that very early stage just to make sure that the hierarchy is representative of your user's needs. And the taxonomy really should be the heart of all your IT systems. So whether it's your content management system, my favorite oxymoron, business intelligence, customer relationship management, intranet, extranet, internet. A lot of times, because of IT requirements, you end up with silos because they've all got their own IT platforms for these systems. Ideally, even if you have those legacy systems and you don't want to junk them, you link them with an information layer that connects them using a common vocabulary. And the taxonomy is the best place to start. It's got limitations, but it's probably the first stage. And I like to talk about a multifaceted taxonomy. So you're not just talking about subject areas. You can ask certain questions of an organization, and the answers will help you design a taxonomy. So you might say, who are we? Where are we? Who are you for? Okay, or who's this for? There we go. And then the answer to those would be entities, to be things, proper nouns. So it might be geographic references. It might be your own organizational business units. Could be external organizations that you can classify by type. It might be lists of relevant laws or individual roles or products. These are all things, and they're fairly easy to find using current software. But you don't want to stop there. You want to be able to say, well, not everything is a thing. Some topics are really subjects, and they define what we do and why we do it. So those could be business activities or issues that come up in business, and I mean business in a broad sense. It could be government business, it could be charitable business, it could be private enterprise. And then business sectors. Again, that doesn't connote private enterprise, just that it's another way of looking at how activities are classified. So you might say, here's a pharmaceutical company, here's a government body, but they're both involved in healthcare. And then you've got the third element, what I call focused filters, which basically answers the question how you use the language. So we're talking about events as one thing, if we look at the earlier presentation, looking at life experiences as a way of organizing government information, a nice category of events would go a long way to answering some of those key questions. You could also organize things by projects or initiatives. Content types is a key way of organizing information. So you can say, this is an interview, this is a photo, this is an audio recording. You can both look at the type and the format of content, which again helps you deliver the right content to the right people. And language is also obviously a very important determinant. So the taxonomy is not just a block. It actually can be broken down into entities, subject matter, and focus filters, which plays a role later on when you're looking at classification rules, or even setting the foundation for machine learning. Making these distinctions at an early stage is very helpful. But obviously we know that taxonomies have limitations. So what the cycle of context does, it says, how do we move from a taxonomy where the main advantage is a hierarchical relationship to adding synonyms where other words mean the same thing. So we have equivalencies, and that's usually what a thesaurus contributes to information architecture. And then the third stage is to look at the associative relationships of an ontology. So you're saying, what are the relationships between these terms, so that you're not just focusing on hierarchical structure, you're not just looking at synonyms, but you're adding relationships. So you essentially you have what now people might call a knowledge graph, or an ontology, where the relationships are important, again, to provide the right context. So I usually start with clients and say, well, let's build a taxonomy and then let's extend it. So what does that look like? So you would have a preferred term. So after talking to all your specialists, you try to agree on the one term that makes sense, that most people use, and then you add synonyms. So if you're looking at the concept of law, you might say, well, we could also say legal system, we could say legislation, and then in the hierarchy, that might come under law and crime. But they're related terms: police, legislators, politics, statutes, regulations. Those are related terms. And then you might have this other idea of contextual keywords. So they're not hierarchical, they're not synonyms, they're not actually in the taxonomy as preferred terms, but they're terms that a specialist would use in discussing this topic, or that if you look in the literature around that topic, you'd find peppered throughout the document. So in this case, lawmaker, senator, congressman, to use US terminology, or it could be MP, House of Lords, white paper, green paper, things like that. So you're usually talking about politics when those terms come up. So again, it's not a formal part of your structure, but if you capture them, it can help disambiguate, and again, providing that vital context. And you get these a lot from just talking to the specialists that you're engaging with. So in our cycle of context, we've built a taxonomy, we've extended with synonyms, but let's take another look at synonyms, because there are places to go to actually find these. If you've had lots of arguments with people about what the preferred term should be, if you didn't have synonyms, you'd be all day arguing about what term to use. But if you can say, we can use synonyms, so it doesn't really matter. This is just the display term. This is what we're going to give the usability specialist to put up on the screen. But if you choose this term, that's great, it works, but you can choose these 5 other terms as well. And so while it's helpful to agree on what we display, these other terms don't go away. They're still acting as synonyms, and that's a very powerful role. So in this example, cardiovascular disease, you could also talk about heart disease, arterial disease, cardiovascular condition, cardiovascular illness. And then you can look at synonym rings, where you can look at repetitive connections. So you can say, I'm tired of saying disease or illness or condition for every medical issue known. So then you just say, wait a minute, disease equals illness equals condition. So then you just have to say cardiovascular disease. And then if cardiovascular condition or illness comes up, they know what it is. So you can build synonym rings. And one thing you can do with synonym rings, I won't go into a lot of detail, but you certainly can on this issue, is build what I call semantic nets. So I was doing a project for a government healthcare agency regulator, and they wanted their analysts to be able to look at documents around the country and look for problems. So we basically built a semantic net that was like a pyramid. And this might have been a slight misuse of synonyms, but I think was actually a creative use. You could say, okay, you're an analyst and you're responsible for the Southwest. So we're going to describe the Southwest as Plymouth, Bristol, Somerset, Devon, Cornwall, Dorset, etc., all the major towns and villages. And you're also worried about things happening that threaten healthcare provision. So let's look at things like financial problems at a healthcare provider, or industrial action, or cases where doctors have been struck off. And we'll build a pyramid where all that sits under the word danger. So as an analyst, you just have to type in Southwest and danger, and then it goes and filters down all these synonyms for all these terrible things that might happen in all these areas that are your responsibility, and suddenly you get a wealth of information coming down. So again, it's a very active way to use synonyms to help get relevant information in context. So we've talked about building a taxonomy, extending it with synonyms, and we now want to look at related topics and the relationships that you'd find in an ontology. So when I say related terms, they're already present in taxonomy. They're already preferred terms, but you're just associating them with another preferred term. And again, this helps you get away from some of the arguments you might have with your users if they're saying, well, I'm not quite sure where to put that in the hierarchy. I think it should go here, but it could also go here. Let's put it in both places. Oh, also, let's put it over here. Now, that's fine up to a point. I had lots of discussions with my colleagues at Reuters about whether Mexico was in North America or Central America. I said, it's in Central America. And they said, but they're in NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Association. I said, that's a political collection, economic collection. Physically, it's in Central America. Oh, let's put it in both. Well, that's fine, but then because the hierarchy works by inheriting all the topics that come above it, usually, if you don't like arguments and you cave in and you put a topic lots of different places, you're going to get lots of different associated tags and metadata that come as you inherit upwards, to the point that you may not actually get specific enough information from your search. So related topics come to your rescue, because you can say, okay, let's put it in Central America, but it can be related to North America, or Mexico as a political or economic entity is part of NAFTA. And there are other ways that you can build in relationships that help diminish the arguments about how many places you might be tempted to put a preferred term. And aside from just saying, here's a related term, it is helpful if you can do it to capture the nature of the relationship. Particularly if you're saying, here is an organization that comprises these members are a member of the organization, and there's you can really go crazy in terms of the relationships, but there'll be some in any organization, some key ones that are useful to capture. So now we get to keywords, and again, I said these are kind of the orphans in a way of the process, because they're not formally part of the structure, but they might eventually become part of the structure. So if you're familiar with the term taxonomy, as you all are, and you probably also know folksonomy. And so the taxonomy, basically the librarians of this world saying, there's order, there's structure, this is how we're going to do it. And then you say, actually, I'd like to change that. Oh, that's a 6-month process. Sorry, just fill in your form here. Whereas a folksonomy, basically, everybody can just say, this is what I want to call it, and I'm going to tag it myself. And that's great. It's very responsive, but it can also be chaotic, because you could have 40 people using 40 different terms for the same thing. The librarian would say, wait a minute, that's rubbish. This is all just one word. But the way this issue has been resolved recently is that I think the librarians and the folks anonymous have come to an agreement that both methods have their uses. And a lot of times you find this with software like in SharePoint, you can have your keywords, and then you can say, oh, that's become such common usage and so widespread, we're going to bump that into the controlled vocabulary. So actually there is some fluidity between these vocabularies. So contextual keywords are basically words that are in context of the topic, but it's not a hierarchical relationship, it's not synonymous, and it's not already in the taxonomy as a related term. So for example, if we were looking at gov.uk and there were documents relating to frailty, that might suggest that there's some age issues or aging issues there. But frailty might not actually exist in any part of the government taxonomy. But if it appears, it gives you some context that we're probably talking about aging. Now, when you're building this extended taxonomy, there are lots of places that you can look. Obviously, discussions of the preferred term, some of the synonyms will have survived. Some will become preferred terms, but related terms. So they're outside the main hierarchy, but they're in another arm or tree or branch of the taxonomy. You can look at what your users are searching for. That's a great way of supplying context, because if you want your language to be user-centric, you might as well go to the users. What are they searching for? And then look at the search logs and say, oh, they're using an entirely different vocabulary for this area of the taxonomy than we've designed. So we've got to do a lot of work to reinvent this just so they know what we're talking about. You can also have your documents that your specialists use. Those are quite useful. There's software that does text mining that usually finds entities, or software that does faceted classification or search, so that you can actually, once you start getting areas of the taxonomy, you can start saying, well, let's look for these terms and what else comes up? What other terms could come? How can we extend the taxonomy in all three of these main structural elements? The other thing that's worth keeping in mind is that a lot of times information architecture relates to unstructured information, documents, but you often in an organization have a whole nother group that is focusing on data and databases. And they may be more aligned with fields and values than your more open-ended approach in documents, but you're both serving the same customers. Sometimes they have to go find information that's in a database. Sometimes they're finding information that's in a document store. They shouldn't have to use two different vocabularies to find those bits of information. The information architecture should bridge those often technically oriented divides. So your taxonomy is basically the same as a conceptual data model. If you move on to an ontology, that's basically the same as a logical data model. So if you can come up with a terms and structure that would be as much at home in a taxonomy ontology as they would conceptual and logical data model, you've gone a long way toward bridging this gap and giving your users just one set of terms they have to know. That also helps you go to outside organizations that might be doing similar things and looking at their vocabularies. And if they've built their taxonomy or their ontology using totally different methods, it's going to be hard to share that information in a way that's meaningful for both of you. But fortunately, there are some standards. You've probably come across the resource description framework, or RDF. People talk about triples. That's not going down to the bar and not being satisfied with a double, but I'll have a triple. They're basically structures that look at their entities, their attributes, and values, so that you can build relationships that are meaningful. So you might say, here's a study, and that's a document type, and it's evidenced by a content type called a report. That report has an author and the author is a named person. So you can still, there's a structure basically for building these relationships that allow you then to look at other vocabularies, maybe outside of your own organization, but if they've also adopted this RDF standard, you can start comparing vocabularies and saying, well, I'll show you yours if you show me mine. That's all right. I'll show you mine if you show me yours. There we go. And it's getting late. And that way you don't just rely on your internal documents and specialists, but you can tap into other organizations that are essentially doing the same thing. So finally, we get to the point of saying, well, I've been employing context, starting with my specialists, and built a taxonomy using taxonomy building tools, and I've extended it with synonyms. I've extended it with related terms and relationships. I've added in keywords. Now, is this thing going to work? And at that point, basically, you need to do some testing. You can do testing all along, but at this stage, now that you've essentially created the full structure, you need to look at how you can build a testing regime. And despite the advances in machine learning and artificial intelligence, I'd argue that it really helps to start with information architecture and a rules-based approach, a little like Paula was talking about, that gives you specific answers that you know are correct, brings you back documents that you know are relevant, and then you can turn your AI algorithms loose on that model and that repository, because you know that they're essentially the correct documents, and you're more likely to get better responses than if you just turn it loose on the internet, which we all know has lots of fake information out there. So if you use a rules-based approach to get the right documents, AI will be much more effective. Now, just let's throw in, how many doing on time, all right? Okay, that's good. Once you have the taxonomy, the next hurdle really is to get it applied consistently. And I work with a lot of media organizations, and they say, oh, great, you've done a taxonomy, that's fine, great. And I said, well, let's see how the users who are responsible for tagging the content actually do it. And I did a study for Dow Jones, and we found out that the accuracy of the editors, who were specialists in their fields, ranged from 40% to 100%, which is pretty wide. And of the 500 stories we looked at, half failed to hit 80% accuracy, which is probably the minimum you'd want. And so they used that study to help make the argument for an automated classification system. And it actually is a lot more efficient, because you can have one person going through who maybe knows the controlled vocabulary and is attaching the tags, but somebody sitting across from her could be using the same taxonomy but applying it differently. And it also is very labor intensive. It takes a lot of time, and you have that built-in inconsistency. So I would say, if you have the choice, the tools out there are now pretty good for automated classification. It's an iterative process, but you can get close to 90, maybe even 95% accuracy, but it would probably be faster for that last 5 to 10% to employ AI with the documents that you already know are pretty much the correct ones and a relevant corpus. So if you're looking at classification, you're basically leveraging this finely tuned taxonomy that you've built. So above, this is my attempt at art. So you have a iceberg. We all know it's bigger underneath. So you have the preferred term and the synonyms that you can all see, but underneath you've got the hierarchy of the taxonomy, so you know what the parent and the child are, the related concepts. They're all clues and contextual pointers to what the information is really about. You can also build in negative examples. So if we go back to the connections puzzle, if you're talking about seal being the aquatic animal or mammal, you basically want to say, give a negative weighting if it refers to seal, the British musician, or seal a type of gasket. It's possible that the mammal and the gasket might appear in the same document, but it's unlikely. But if you find lots of references to the mammal, then if you find a reference to seal, it's probably not what we're talking about, being the musician. Okay. So when you're building a rule for classification, I found it's quite useful to look at a combination of elements that really leverages the taxonomy. So you can say, I want a term that appears frequently. That's usually a pretty good test of relevance. But I also want the terms I'm looking for to be in prominent locations. I don't want them to be in the footnotes. I want them to be in the URL or the title or the first paragraph. So you're basically combining frequency and prominence to find a good evidence of a topic. And you also would like it to be concurrent or proximate to other terms, like the related terms that you've gone to a lot of effort to identify. Or it's close to a lot of keywords that you know are relevant. So if you can build a rule that basically says, look for frequency, look for prominence, look for proximity, you're going to get a high degree of accuracy. And if you use or for that bottom one, you're going to get more recall. You're going to get a wider selection of documents, but fewer of them might be relevant. If you really want precision, it would be and under both of those elements. Okay. And once you come up with that structure, you can basically plug it into different classification or search engines because they're basically using the same elements. You're using the preferred terms, and then you're using the synonyms, the related terms, the keywords, and you're applying Boolean logic. Once you've written that rule, you can just basically plug in every row of your database or spreadsheet, and you have a ready-made rule, and you can plug that rule into different types of searches or classification engines. And it's basically an effective way of using mail merge. So if you ever use a database to do Christmas cards addresses, you're just plugging in the data into the same format. And that's essentially what you can do with rules. So that way you can tinker with the taxonomy by adding more synonyms or more related topics, or you can tinker with the weights of these elements in the rules, but you don't have to write a new rule for every topic in the taxonomy, because that would be madness. So basically, you're using the taxonomy structure to contribute to your relevancy weightings. So you're looking at frequency, as we mentioned, prominence, concurrence, but you can also look at the facet of the taxonomy, and you can say entities are easy to find, but they don't really tell us a lot. So give greater weight to the subject area. If you remember that 3-section multifaceted taxonomy, you'd want to give greater weight to the subject areas. That really tells you what the document's about, not necessarily the entities that it mentions or the type of content that it is. And the depth of the taxonomy is also useful because usually as you go lower in the taxonomy, you're getting down into more detail. So you can give higher weightings to lower levels in the taxonomy. So that brings us back to the final stage in the cycle of context, which is governance, which is basically checking that what you've built works with the original people that you engaged with, your users and your specialists. And you want to come up with a taxonomy process for governance that's both transparent and representative. And then basically you start the cycle again. You say, okay, do you approve of what we've done? Okay, now let's keep it relevant. Let's keep it evolving with the same people going through that process again and again until you keep refining it to the highest level of accuracy. Okay, time for questions.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. Two questions. First question, it can be extremely challenging to design a taxonomy for a mature, complex organization, like the civil service department, for example.
Yes.
How would you get started?
I would certainly look at what had already been designed, but if they were bringing in new people or were taking another look at it, my assumption would be that there was something wrong with it, but I would test that assumption. Sometimes these things can get political, and it could be like, oh, we're not going to use your taxonomy, we're going to use my taxonomy, and it might not be an improvement. So I think first look at the reasons why they need a taxonomy, what purpose it serves, what already exists in terms of controlled vocabularies and try to retain what's useful from what they've already designed, but don't blind yourself to the fact that it probably could be improved, and just talk to users with an open mind.
Final question. Can you share insights into how you compare data models and taxonomies are comprehensive and future-proof?
I think the first thing to accept is that you'll never finish it. If your organization, I mean, no organization really is static. They don't survive if they are. So things are going to be changing, and what you need is the flexibility to change the elements without changing the basic structure or the basic process. So you don't want things to change and then say, oh, things have changed so much, we have to junk the old taxonomy and start fresh. Or, well, this data model doesn't work anymore. So if you start from the beginning with the assumption that you're going to have to evolve, you're going to have to change, look for components that are reusable and flexible. So, for example, one way of doing that would be, don't base the taxonomy around the corporate structure, because that's going to change in 18 months, I guarantee you. Build it around work areas or topics or with entities. So certainly represent the structure as part of the taxonomy, but don't make that the main operating thread. That way, as things change and evolve, you can say, well, we still have something called entities. We still have something called subjects. It's just, oh, now we've got a new subject, or now we've got a new entity. We don't say, oh, it's changed so much, we have to change so you start at a high enough level of abstraction that essentially anything will fit underneath it. And then you just change those elements underneath it, but the basic structure and the basic process remains the same.